What I want to do, instead of going through any piece of the stories that the paper tells, and it tells two, the story of the 1766 grain embargo and the subsequent indemnification statute, and the 1775 decision by the Crown to move troops illegally from Hanover, the personal troops of George, to some important outposts in the Mediterranean. What's interesting to me is how these episodes ended up representing a much thicker practice, the expectation, the participation in a much thicker practice of lawbreaking as an ordinary and expected part of governance in a political culture that was simultaneously intensely reverential, at least overtly, sometimes perhaps the praise that vice pays to virtue, hypocrisy, and so forth, but intensely reverential for law as such. To invoke law as a move to suggest that somebody had done something illegal was a really big deal. It was very invested in the idea, the distinction between law and policy, and then was also sort of fundamentally Whiggish, not in the sense that there weren't differing views on what the role an executive should have vis-a-vis the legislature and so forth, but in the much thinner sense that government in general, and specifically the executive, oughtn't act without some kind of legal authorization. And authorization can come from a variety of sources, including the prerogative. But there's this deep investment in a culture of legality and a belief in the distinction between law and policy. But also this very strange, and emotionally so, right? An emotional investment in this. You can see it with the invective that's hurled at the administration in both episodes by people who call it unlawful. But then also this strange, taken for granted conversation about indemnification for illegal action that ends up playing, I think, in spaces that have been written about, certainly sort of virtue concepts of governance, both Republican and otherwise, but also sort of honor culture scholarship, which I think of as sort of a separate set of norms and expectations, often gendered language around manliness, the thing you don't want to be doing is skulking. You want to be forthright and manly. For these two things to coexist at the same time is just extremely interesting to me. And then also ends up setting up what I hadn't appreciated before, 4 or 5 years ago, was a much richer background of this simply happening as a matter of course, on which people like Jefferson and Lincoln draw. And that represents not something in which people like Lincoln and Jefferson were actually at all innovators in their writings on the subjects, but just participating in a way of talking about sometimes you have to break the law and here's why and here's what it looks like, that really goes back a long ways. So lots of questions flow from it, but that's, I guess, all I want to say by way of opening statement.